Joined now by political analyst Sandile Swana to talk a little bit more about the significance of this registration drives and the numbers that are being touted. A very good evening to you and thank you so much for speaking to us. I'd like to just start with the IEC's target. They said they'd hoped they'd reach 1 million. It would seem that they have surpassed that from the figures that they are giving us. But what is the importance of this? It also gets a backdrop of the census results of 2022, which showed that the population has grown to 62 million inhabitants with an estimated 39.7 million voting age population.
I think that once you bring in the census, obviously the targets that the IEC has set itself so becomes modest. But the big thing that most of us need to look at is whether there is any degree, and we do not know that information now, maybe by the end of the week we will know, whether there is any indication in the million that the younger generation is starting to gain interest in the electoral process and in political decision making in the country. That would be the issue. Even when during the Mbeki era, there was a certain measure of decline in participation by the general public in the elections. So there is a need to revive in a very serious way. The number of 1 million does look modest for the time being.
And also just looking at, I believe if, this figure is current, that the voters' roll stands at 26.2 million, representing just 66% of the estimated voting age population. So if we're saying 1 million or more than 1 million have registered, as you say, we don't know whether it's the young cohort, but most importantly, whether these are new registrations or it's just simply people who already are on the voters' roll.
Yeah, so that will be important. My assumption, unless I read obviously these are media reports, not official reports of the IEC, that it does look like we're getting new registration. And if it is, then it means we're starting to move in the right direction. I would imagine that the IEC does its own calculation to predict the type of realistic growth rate that they can achieve in terms of that, and the political parties, more especially the younger ones, the ones targeting the younger voters, will want to see that the younger voters are coming in, whereas the older political parties, being the ANC and the DA, may be still wanting to see the older voters keeping them in power. So those are the dynamics of this.
Just listening yesterday to the EFF's leader, Julius Malema, dispelling the myth that he says that younger voters are apathetic, that when you look at the decline, it doesn't mean that they don't want to vote. But I want you to talk to me as a political scientist how we measure this. We've been told that there's been a lot of protest voting in the past couple of elections when looking at the decline in the numbers of people who actually have gone out and cast their ballots. And there seems to be a great deal of frustration that's been coming out from the electorate around issues of obviously a declining economy, lack of service delivery when it comes to electricity and water, those basic services. So when we look at what actually gets people out of their houses to go into voting stations and make their mark, is it issue driven, or is it what the IEC keeps on saying, that you have a responsibility to exercise your democratic rights?
I think that, you look at the participation in the build-up to the 1994 election. People really believed that, at least in those first two elections, that these elections matter and these elections are going to cause a change in their day-to-day lives. And indeed, from 1994 to 2008, there were measurable changes in the voting. But what I also can say is that in my observation, even when South Africa started prospering, and even when the ANC was gaining an increasing number of votes, it was gaining those votes in a declining voter base. So people saw that things are going well. They were not increasing. The number of voters was actually not increasing, although the ANC majority was decreasing. The protest vote that we are talking about came after the Polokwane conference, where the supporters of the ANC started reducing their support of the ANC, and then there was a general lack of participation. And lately, we've also seen the support for the DA declining. So the issue for the younger politicians and the newer political parties is to then take us back to where we were in 1994 or in that period to say, if you vote, there can be an actual difference in your life. And you need to continue to participate in the day-to-day political life for things to change in your area where you live, in the province where you live, and in the country as a whole.
Just as you speak about the ANC and the Polokwane conference, just looking back at some of their policy documents saying the first 18 years was the first transition to democratizing the state, transitioning society. And there's been a lot of talk about this being the second transition. In layman's terms, what does it mean to people when you say go out and vote, and this is the policy directive that you're expecting from the governing party, even though the bid is to unseat them? It was quite interesting to read SMP's statement about saying they see the ANC losing its majority, but they see stability in terms of policy directives.
The issue here, when you talk about the second transitions and things like that, I think there's a sense in which we can say the first transition where human rights kicked into South Africa, freedom of speech, we can have interviews like this that we're having now and talk about any matter that we want to talk about. That type of thing of civil rights and all that sort of thing, I think certainly Nelson Mandela and his generation brought that about. There was a degree of economic changes that happened, and the main changes that happened in the Mbeki era was the GDP growth and starting to reduce unemployment. What has failed to happen, which I would characterize as the second transition, is the democratization of economic gains. In other words, the standard of living in Soweto moving closer to the standard of living in Randburg and Sandile, and so on and so forth, so that the standard of economic growth, household incomes and things like that, across the villages, across the townships, across the suburbs, starts to be even and at the correct rate of development. Because right now we're struggling to get even an economic growth of 1% and things like that. It's just bad, it's dire. So that is where anybody wants to talk about the second transition. It is about the democratization of the economy so that every Tom, Dick and Harry can get a fair share of the economy.